James' wisdom, controlling the tongue, the flesh, and the battle within, from the very beginning of the human story. There has always been a war that no one sees, yet everyone feels. It is not fought with swords or armies. It does not make noise in the streets or appear in the news, and yet it is the most decisive battle any person will ever face. It is the battle within. A silent conflict between the spirit that longs for God and the flesh that pulls toward impulse, pride, fear, and desire. The book of James speaks directly into this struggle with a clarity that is almost uncomfortable. It does not flatter. It does not soften its message. It confronts the heart, exposes intentions, and calls the believer to a life of discipline, humility, and spiritual maturity. James understood something that many avoid admitting. Faith is not proven by words, emotions, or religious appearance. Faith is revealed in control. Control of the tongue, control of desires, control of reactions, control of pride, control of the self. And this control is not something the flesh can achieve on its own. It is the result of surrender, awareness, and an ongoing inner battle that must be fought daily. The wisdom of James does not exist to make us comfortable. It exists to make us free. And freedom, according to James, begins when a person learns to master what seems small but holds enormous power. The tongue, the impulses of the flesh, and the inner world where thoughts are born before actions follow. This is not a message for the casual believer. This is for those who feel the tension inside themselves, those who love God but still wrestle with anger, impatience, temptation, pride, and distraction, those who know what is right but feel how hard it is to live it consistently. James speaks directly to that struggle, not to condemn, but to awaken. Because once you understand the battle within, you stop fighting the wrong enemies, and you begin the real work, the tongue, the smallest weapon, with the greatest power. James begins with a warning that feels almost too simple to be dangerous. He speaks of the tongue, a small piece of the body, soft, light, invisible most of the time. And yet, according to James, it holds the power to shape destinies, destroy relationships, ignite conflicts, and reveal the true state of the heart. He writes that the tongue is like a small rudder that steers a great ship, like a tiny spark that sets an entire forest on fire. These are not poetic exaggerations, they are spiritual realities, because words are never neutral. They either build or destroy, heal or wound, bring light or deepen darkness. The tongue reveals what lives inside a person long before actions do. You can pretend to be patient, but your words will expose irritation. You can pretend to be humble, but your words will reveal pride. You can pretend to be faithful, but your speech will expose fear, doubt, or control. James understood that many people want spiritual growth without emotional discipline. They want divine favor without self-examination. They want to pray powerfully but speak carelessly, but it does not work that way. The mouth becomes the mirror of the soul. Every time you speak, something inside you is being expressed. This is why James says that no one can tame the tongue on their own, because the tongue does not act independently. It obeys what rules the heart. And the heart is a battlefield. The flesh wants to speak quickly. It reacts. It defends itself. It wants to be right. It wants to be seen. It wants to win arguments. It wants validation. The flesh speaks before thinking, reacts before praying, responds before listening. The Spirit, however, is slow. The Spirit listens. The Spirit weighs words. The Spirit understands that silence can be more powerful than speech. The Spirit knows that not every truth must be spoken, and not every emotion deserves a voice. This is why James says, "Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." That sentence alone contains a lifetime of wisdom. Anger, according to James, is often born not from injustice, but from impatience, from wounded pride, from unmet expectations, from the flesh demanding control. And when anger takes control of the tongue, damage follows almost immediately. Words spoken in anger cannot be retrieved. They remain in memory. They reshape relationships. They create wounds that apologies cannot always heal. And this is why James connects the tongue to spiritual maturity. He says that if someone can control their tongue, they are mature in every other area. Not because speech is the hardest discipline, but because it reflects all the others. If you can control your words, you have learned to control your reactions. If you can control your speech, you have learned to pause. If you can pause, you have begun to master your flesh. If you have mastered your flesh, you are walking in spiritual strength. The battle of the tongue is not about silence. It is about awareness. It is about recognizing when your flesh wants to speak and choosing to let your spirit respond instead. This is why prayer changes speech. Not because it magically alters vocabulary, but because it reshapes the inner world from which words flow. A heart filled with resentment cannot produce gentle words. A heart full of fear cannot speak peace. A heart ruled by pride cannot speak humility. James exposes a hard truth. Many people think they are spiritual because they pray, attend religious spaces, or speak about God. But the true test is how they speak when they are tired, offended, misunderstood, or challenged. That is where the real self appears. And this is also where the battle is won or lost. The flesh wants immediate release. The spirit seeks long-term transformation. The flesh says, say it now. The spirit says, wait. The flesh says, defend yourself. The spirit says, trust God. The flesh says, you deserve to respond. The spirit says, let peace speak for you. James does not say this battle will be easy. He says it is necessary, because a person who cannot control their tongue will never fully control their life, and a person who learns to govern their speech begins to govern their destiny. This is why silence is often the first sign of spiritual maturity. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of weakness, but the silence of strength. The silence of someone who knows that not every thought deserves expression. The silence of someone who understands that God fights battles we choose not to engage in. The tongue reveals who is winning the war inside you. And every day, every conversation, every reaction, you are choosing which side has authority. This is only the beginning of James's message. Because once the tongue is confronted, something deeper must be faced next, the flesh itself, and the war it wages against the spirit, the flesh, the invisible enemy, living within you. When James speaks about the inner battle, he does not point outward. He does not blame society, circumstances, or other people. He goes straight to the place most people avoid looking at, the human heart. The real battlefield is not outside of you. It is within you. And the enemy is not always obvious, loud, or dramatic. Often the greatest enemy is subtle, familiar, and disguised as your own voice. The flesh is not simply the body. It is the inner inclination that seeks comfort over growth, pleasure over purpose, control over surrender. It is the part of us that wants immediate relief instead of long-term transformation. And because it feels natural, it is often mistaken for instinct, logic, or even self-care. James makes something very clear. Temptation does not come from God. It comes from desire. And desire, when it is not disciplined, slowly drags the soul away from truth. This is not a sudden fall. It is a quiet drift. The flesh does not rush. It waits. It starts with a thought that seems harmless. A feeling that seems justified, a reaction that feels understandable, a choice that seems small, and before a person realizes it, that small choice has formed a habit, and that habit has shaped a direction. This is how spiritual distance begins. The flesh always promises relief, but never delivers peace. It promises satisfaction, but leaves emptiness. It promises control, but produces anxiety. It promises freedom, but leads to bondage, and yet it speaks so convincingly. James reveals something uncomfortable but necessary. Many of the struggles people blame on the world are actually born inside them. Envy, anger, conflict, restlessness, impatience, pride. These are not accidents. They are symptoms of an inner war that has not been confronted. The flesh does not want to be confronted. It wants to be fed. It feeds on comparison. It feeds on resentment. It feeds on attention. It feeds on validation. It feeds on comfort. It feeds on escape. And the more it is fed, the louder it becomes. That is why James connects spiritual maturity to self-control. Not because discipline saves a person, but because discipline reveals who is in control. When the flesh is in control, life becomes reactive. Emotions dictate decisions. Circumstances dictate peace. Other people's opinions dictate self-worth. But when the Spirit begins to lead, something changes. The person becomes slower to react, quieter in conflict, more reflective, less impulsive, more grounded. Not because they are suppressing themselves, but because they have learned to pause. And that pause is sacred. It is in the pause that the Spirit speaks. It is in the pause that wisdom emerges. It is in the pause that temptation loses its power. The flesh hates silence. It hates waiting. It hates reflection, because in silence, its voice weakens. James teaches that humility is the doorway to victory, and humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking less about yourself. It is releasing the need to always be right, always be seen, always be satisfied immediately. Humility allows God to work where pride blocks him. That is why James says that God gives grace to the humble, but resists the proud. Pride does not mean arrogance alone. It also appears as self-reliance, stubbornness, and the refusal to change. A proud heart says, "I know." A humble heart says, "Teach me." A proud heart says, "I can handle this." A humble heart says, "I need guidance." A proud heart reacts. A humble heart reflects. The flesh wants control. The Spirit seeks alignment. And this is where the battle becomes very real, very personal, and very daily. Because the flesh does not disappear when someone becomes spiritual. In fact, sometimes it becomes more aggressive. When a person starts to grow, the flesh feels threatened. It pushes harder. It brings stronger urges, stronger doubts, stronger emotions. This is why many people feel more tension when they try to live rightly. They assume something is wrong. But often, it is a sign that something is finally being confronted. Growth feels like resistance. Transformation feels uncomfortable. Maturity feels lonely at times. James does not sugarcoat this. He acknowledges the struggle, but he also offers a path forward: submission to God. Submission is not weakness. It is alignment. When a person submits their thoughts, desires, and impulses to God, something powerful happens. The inner noise begins to quiet. The constant battle for control begins to ease. And slowly, clarity replaces confusion. Not because life becomes easy, but because the heart becomes anchored. The flesh loses power when it is no longer obeyed. The Spirit gains strength when it is consistently chosen. And this choice is not dramatic. It is daily. It happens when you choose silence instead of argument, when you choose patience instead of reaction, when you choose integrity instead of convenience, when you choose obedience instead of comfort. These moments seem small, but they shape everything. James wants the reader to understand this. Spiritual maturity is not about perfection. It is about direction. It is about choosing again and again to let the Spirit lead, even when the flesh resists. Because in the end, the battle within determines the life without, and the one who learns to master the inner war begins to walk in a peace that circumstances cannot steal. The divided mind. Biblical examples of the inner battle and the cost of instability. James speaks with unusual clarity when he warns about the danger of a divided mind. He says that a person who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. This image is powerful because it reveals something deeply human. A divided mind is not an evil mind. It is a confused one, a heart pulled in two directions, a soul that wants God but still clings to control, comfort, or fear. This inner division is one of the greatest causes of spiritual stagnation. Throughout the Bible, we see example after example of people who struggled not because they lacked faith, but because their faith was divided. They believed, but not fully. They trusted, but not completely. They obeyed, but only halfway. And that hesitation always produced instability. One of the clearest examples is King Saul. Saul was chosen by God, anointed, empowered, given authority, but from the very beginning, his heart was divided. He wanted God's approval, but he also wanted people's approval. He wanted to obey God, but he feared losing control. He wanted to lead, but he did not want to surrender. When Samuel told him to wait for God's instruction, Saul waited, but not long enough. Fear took over. Impatience spoke louder than obedience. And in that moment, Saul offered a sacrifice he was not supposed to offer. It seemed small, logical, justified, but it revealed something deep. Saul trusted his own reasoning more than God's command. This is what a divided mind looks like: outwardly faithful, inwardly restless, spiritually active, internally insecure. And the result was tragic. Saul slowly lost clarity, peace, and eventually his sense of identity. The more he tried to control his circumstances, the more unstable he became. Jealousy consumed him, fear ruled him, and the presence of God, once so near, began to feel distant. James warns about this exact pattern. He says that a double-minded person is unstable in all their ways, not some ways, always, because when the heart is divided, every decision becomes unstable. Another powerful example is Peter. Peter loved Jesus deeply. He was passionate, loyal, and sincere. He declared with confidence that he would never deny Christ. Yet, only hours later, he denied him 3 times. Why? Because Peter had not yet learned the difference between emotional confidence and spiritual stability. He believed in Jesus, but he also trusted his own strength too much. He thought his devotion would be enough. But when pressure came, fear took over. The flesh spoke louder than faith. And yet, Peter's story does not end in failure. Because after his fall, something changed. He became aware of his weakness. And that awareness became the doorway to true strength. When Jesus later restored Peter, he did not give him confidence in himself. He gave him responsibility rooted in humility. That is what James is pointing toward. A divided mind produces instability. A surrendered heart produces endurance. James does not say that doubt disqualifies a person. He says that living in doubt without seeking resolution keeps a person unstable. God is not afraid of questions. He is not threatened by weakness, but he resists double allegiance. You cannot fully follow God while secretly clinging to control. You cannot grow spiritually while feeding fear. You cannot walk in faith while constantly negotiating with doubt. Another powerful biblical example is Elijah. After one of the greatest spiritual victories in history, calling fire down from heaven, Elijah fell into deep fear and despair. He ran, he hid, he asked God to take his life. Why? Because his mind shifted from faith to fear, from divine power to human threat. What is remarkable is that God did not rebuke him harshly. God fed him, let him rest, then spoke to him in a whisper, because God knows something important. Exhaustion makes the mind unstable. Fear grows when the soul is tired. Doubt becomes louder when the heart is overwhelmed. James understood this human fragility. That is why he speaks so much about endurance, about patience, about perseverance, because faith is not proven in moments of excitement, but in moments of waiting. A divided mind wants immediate answers. A mature mind learns to trust the process. A divided heart asks, "Why is this happening to me?" A surrendered heart asks, "What is this teaching me?" This is where many believers struggle. They want faith to remove discomfort, but God often uses discomfort to refine faith. They want clarity before obedience, but God often gives clarity after obedience. James reminds us that faith is not passive belief. It is active trust. It is choosing to stand firm even when emotions fluctuate, even when circumstances confuse, even when prayers seem unanswered. The Bible is full of people who had to walk before they understood. Abraham left his land without knowing where he was going. Joseph endured betrayal before purpose. Moses wandered before leading. David waited years after being anointed. Jesus himself submitted before being glorified. None of them had perfect clarity at every step. What they had was surrender. And this is what James is calling the reader toward. Not perfection, not emotional certainty, but spiritual stability. A heart that says, "Even if I don't understand, I will trust." A mind that says, "Even if I feel weak, I will remain faithful." A soul that says, "Even if the path is unclear, I will not turn back." This is the kind of faith that silences the flesh. This is the kind of faith that steadies the mind. This is the kind of faith that transforms a person from within. And when a person reaches this place, something powerful happens. They stop being driven by emotion. They stop being shaken by opinion. They stop being controlled by fear. They become anchored. And that is when the battle within begins to turn in their favor. When this story becomes your story. At some point, this message stops being about biblical characters and starts being about you. Because if you are listening to this, there is a strong chance that you recognize yourself somewhere in this struggle. Maybe not in dramatic ways, maybe not in obvious sins, but in the quiet battles that no one else sees, the inner tension, the tiredness of trying to do what is right while feeling pulled in another direction. The feeling of wanting peace, but constantly fighting thoughts, emotions, and impulses that refuse to stay silent. This is where the message of James becomes deeply personal. You may not be King Saul, standing before an army. You may not be Peter, standing before a crowd. You may not be Elijah, running into the wilderness. But you know what it feels like to be torn inside. You know what it feels like to want to change but fall back into the same patterns. You know what it feels like to promise yourself you'll do better, only to repeat the same behavior. You know what it feels like to believe in God, yet still struggle with fear, impatience, anger, or doubt. And sometimes, that inner conflict makes you wonder if something is wrong with you. James speaks directly to that feeling, because the struggle itself is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that something inside you is alive. The dead do not struggle. The disconnected do not wrestle. The indifferent do not question themselves. The battle you feel is evidence that your spirit is awake. The problem is not that you struggle. The problem is when you stop paying attention to what the struggle is trying to teach you. Many people live on autopilot. They wake up, repeat the same routines, react the same way, speak the same words, and make the same choices. Days turn into years, and one day they wake up feeling empty, disconnected, or spiritually numb, without knowing when it started. But the truth is, it started with small compromises, moments when you ignored your conscience, moments when you chose comfort over growth, moments when you stayed silent instead of being honest, moments when you reacted instead of reflecting, moments when you fed the flesh instead of listening to the Spirit, and none of those moments seemed important at the time. That is exactly how the inner battle works. James is not talking to perfect people. He is talking to people who are tired of living divided, people who feel the tension between who they are and who they know they should become, people who sense that there is more to life than surviving, but do not know how to step into that more. If you have ever felt frustrated with yourself for repeating the same mistakes, if you have ever felt guilty for knowing the right thing but not doing it, if you have ever felt like your faith was real, but your actions didn't always reflect it, then this message is speaking directly to you, because the battle James describes is not theoretical, it is daily. It shows up in your relationships, in your decisions, in your reactions, in your thoughts, when no one else is watching. It shows up when you want to speak, but know you should stay silent. When you want to give up, but something inside tells you to keep going. When you want to choose comfort, but you feel called to choose growth. When you want to react emotionally, but a quiet voice tells you to pause. That quiet voice is not weakness. That is the Spirit calling you to maturity. And maturity does not mean perfection. It means awareness. It means you begin to notice yourself. You catch your thoughts before they become actions. You recognize patterns before they become habits. You feel conviction before destruction. This is what James means when he talks about being a doer of the word, not just a hearer. A hearer listens and moves on. A doer listens and allows the truth to confront them. A hearer feels inspired. A doer feels challenged. And that challenge is uncomfortable, because growth always requires letting go of something familiar. For some it is anger, for others it is control, for some it is pride, for others it is fear. For many it is the need to be understood, validated or praised. James is asking a very honest question. Who is really in charge of your life? Is it your emotions, your past, your wounds, your habits, your desires, or is it the Spirit within you that longs for something higher? The reason this message hits so deeply is because most people are tired of pretending, tired of appearances, tired of wearing masks, tired of feeling like they're constantly failing some invisible standard. What James offers is not condemnation, but clarity. He reminds us that transformation does not happen through guilt. It happens through awareness and obedience, through small, consistent decisions, through choosing alignment over impulse, through choosing patience over reaction, through choosing humility over ego. And the beautiful part is this: you do not have to fix everything at once. You only have to be honest with where you are. The moment you become honest with yourself, the process begins. The moment you stop pretending, growth starts. The moment you admit your weakness, strength begins to form, because God does not work through perfection. He works through surrender. And surrender does not mean giving up. It means trusting that something greater is shaping you, even in the struggle. If you are listening to this and feeling seen, that is not an accident. If something inside you feels stirred, that is not coincidence. If you feel both uncomfortable and understood, that is usually a sign of truth. This story is not about ancient people. It is about you, right now, in this moment, in this battle. And the fact that you are still here, still listening, still reflecting, means the story is not over. It means the work is still happening. Walking it out. How to live this truth every day. At the end of everything James teaches, there is one truth that becomes impossible to ignore. The battle within is not meant to be won once, but lived through daily. There is no final moment where struggle disappears forever. There is no point where the flesh stops whispering or where life becomes completely predictable. What changes is not the existence of the battle, but the way you face it. And this is where everything becomes real. Because spirituality is not proven in moments of inspiration. It is proven in ordinary days, in how you speak when you are tired, in how you respond when you are misunderstood, in how you choose when no one is watching, in how you treat people who cannot give you anything in return. This is where James brings the message home. Faith is not what you say you believe. Faith is what you live when life presses you. If you want this teaching to become something practical, something that actually changes your life, it begins with awareness, not judgment, not guilt, awareness. Start by paying attention to your reactions. Notice what triggers you. Notice what drains your peace. Notice what repeatedly pulls you off balance. Notice what makes you defensive. Notice what makes you impatient. Notice what you justify over and over again. These are not random. They are indicators. They show you where the battle is happening inside you. Then begin practicing pause. Before responding, pause. Before reacting, pause. Before speaking, pause. Before deciding, pause. That pause is where the spirit has space to speak. Most people lose control, not because they are evil, but because they move too fast. They speak before thinking. They decide before reflecting. They react before listening. But James teaches that wisdom is slow, calm, and grounded. You do not have to answer everything. You do not have to defend yourself every time. You do not have to prove your worth. You do not have to win every argument. Sometimes strength looks like silence. Sometimes wisdom looks like walking away. Sometimes maturity looks like restraint. Another practical step is learning to check your motivations. Ask yourself simple but powerful questions. Why am I saying this? Why do I want this? Why am I reacting this way? What am I really feeling underneath this emotion? Often, what we call anger is actually fear. What we call frustration is often disappointment. What we call control is often insecurity. When you become honest with yourself, the battle loses much of its power. The flesh thrives in confusion. The spirit thrives in clarity. Another essential practice is consistency, not intensity. Consistency. You do not need dramatic spiritual moments every day. You need small, steady habits that align your heart. A few minutes of silence, a moment of reflection, a sincere prayer, a decision to respond differently than you used to. These small choices reshape the inner world, and over time, something remarkable happens. You begin to feel more grounded, more stable, less reactive, less anxious, more aware, more at peace. Not because life becomes easier, but because you become stronger on the inside. James teaches that endurance produces maturity, and maturity produces stability, and stability produces peace. This is the path. Not perfection, not performance, not religious appearance, but inner alignment. And maybe the most important thing to remember is this: you are not alone in this process. The struggle you feel does not mean you are failing. It means you are growing. The resistance you feel does not mean something is wrong. It means something is being reshaped. The discomfort you feel does not mean you are lost. It means you are being refined. Growth often feels like tension before it feels like peace. So if you are listening to this and thinking, this sounds like me, know this: you are exactly where you need to be to begin changing. You do not need to fix everything today. You only need to take one honest step, one pause, one conscious choice, one moment of awareness, one decision to respond differently. And tomorrow, you do it again. That is how the battle within is won. Not with force, not with fear, but with faith, consistency, and humility. James was right. The tongue can be controlled. The flesh can be disciplined. The mind can be stabilized. The heart can be transformed. And when that happens, life begins to change from the inside out. Not loudly, not suddenly, but deeply, permanently, and powerfully. If you carry this with you, not just as words, but as a way of living, you will begin to notice something beautiful. The war inside you will slowly turn into wisdom. The chaos will turn into clarity. And the struggle will become strength. And that is the true victory.